A long, long time, his home was a little cabin in a beautiful, secluded place called Cozy Valley. He had a favorite story about the animals in the valley. A story about Doc Owl, that wise old bird, and Rowdy the Crow, that noisy one. Buttons the Squirrel, she was in the story too. And so were Ringtail the Raccoon, Snoozy the Possum, Mrs. Beaver and her twins, and Grandfather's favorite, Velvet the Fawn. Then there was Mischief the Fox, that troublesome rascal who was always hungry. And there were some other animals too. But let me tell you the whole story, just the way my grandfather used to tell it to me about the animals of Cozy Valley. He called his story, How the Animals Discovered Christmas. It was a clear, star-bright night, the enchanting night before Christmas, and all was quiet in our valley. Old Doc Owl was taking a nap in his oak tree when he heard something and asked his favorite question, Who? Well, who was it that woke him up? It was Velvet the Fawn, going along the path that went near our cabin. He stopped to look. Inside, we were bustling about, getting ready for Christmas. Oh, I remember it so well. Velvet came close and looked into the window. He saw me decorating the tree. But of course, he'd never seen a Christmas tree before, with lights and ornaments. Then I happened to notice him. When he saw I was watching him, he bounded away. He kept running. He was about to lie down when... What was that? A bird? A bluebird? What was he doing in our valley in the winter? He should have flown south. But then Velvet could see that this bluebird had a broken wing. Very gently, he lifted the bluebird up, and away they went. Velvet headed for the oak tree where old Doc Owl lived. Well, it was a bluebird, that's who said he'd spread the news. Down he flew to the home of Buttons the Squirrel. Took her up. Doc Owl said, "We've got an injured bluebird and need some help." Buttons agreed to get the other animals, and Doc Owl said he'd watch over the bluebird. Doc kept the bluebird warm, while Buttons went to wake up the rest of the animals. She pulled Scamper the rabbit out of his hole under the old oak. Then she scurried over to get pummeled and pressed. And then she pulled and pulled, and oh, what a problem that sleepyhead was. Finally, Buttons pushed, and that did it. Meanwhile, Scamper the rabbit raced to the old stone fence to get Ringtail the raccoon. Scamper explained about the bluebird with the broken wing. Would Ringtail help? Good, Ringtail would come. Scamper's next stop was Mrs. Beaver's house on the frozen pond. Mrs. Beaver said she'd help, but she'd have to bring her twins, too. On his way back, Scamper took the path that went by our cabin. And I know he saw our tree and heard our Christmas music. Meanwhile, Buttons was on her way to call Rowdy the Crow, when suddenly, there was Mischief the Fox. If only Buttons could reach a tree. Just then, Rowdy began calling to attract Mischief. Mischief jumped and missed. Buttons saw her chance, and up she went, safe and sound. Finally, Doc Owl and all the animals were gathered. Now, how could they help the injured bluebird through the winter? Doc Owl was in charge, since he was the wisest one. They could all see that the bluebird could never fly south this year. His broken wing could heal. Who? Doc Owl asked who could provide a home for the bluebird. None of the animals had a home big enough for the bluebird to exercise his wing when it healed. He'd need a snug, warm home, a home safe from Mischief the Fox, a home that was... And then Doc Owl thought of it. Of course, there was one place, and he pointed the way. They all knew where it was, the home of Grumbles the bear. It was a big cave, almost closed by a snowdrift. Who would volunteer to shovel? Who? I'll do it, said Mrs. Beaver. With my tail. The twins helped too, and pretty soon they could hear Grumbles snoring. They had to wake him up so they could explain about the bluebird and his broken wing. Grumbles said he'd be willing to let the bluebird share his warm cave until spring. Could they use this handkerchief as a bandage? They could use that. And in a little while, the bluebird's wing was carefully wrapped. He tried to sing a song of thanks, but... And so, very quietly, old Doc Owl led the animals out of Grumbles' cave. Now he suggested they should gather some food for the bluebird and something for him to sleep on. So that is what they did. Velvet uncovered some soft moss for the bluebird's bed. Scamper got the carrots he had saved. Buttons had some sweet hazelnuts. Rowdy brought his dried sunflower seeds. And Snoozy dug out some dried apples. Mrs. Beaver bit off some purple dogwood berries. And Ringtail brought 2 sweet potatoes. They were putting their food near a little tree near Grumbles' cave when Scamper looked at the tree and remembered something. Why not hang the food where the bluebird would see it on the tree, like the one he'd seen in our cabin? Soon they were hanging up their gifts, making a game of it. And in no time at all, they had added bittersweet berries the color of flame, the dried sunflowers, and all the other gifts. The Beaver twins had brought some icicles, and there in the moonlight, the little tree gleamed. But now it was late, and they were tired. Doc suggested that they turn in and come back in the morning to show the bluebird what they had done. On his way home, Velvet went bounding along the path that passed near our cabin when he heard something. There! Reindeer! Reindeer! Much like Velvet himself. They were harnessed to a beautiful red sleigh filled with toys and packages. The reindeer told Velvet it was Christmas Eve, that wondrous night when people exchange gifts to show their love for one another. Anyway, just as they were getting better acquainted,
Ho, 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 ho!
Velvet didn't wait to see more. When he reached his hideaway, he heard the little bells again, and there above him were the reindeer and sleigh.
Ho, ho, ho!
It was early Christmas morning, and the tree near Grumbles' cave sparkled in the morning light. It was time to call the bluebird. Right behind the bluebird was Grumbles. He was still sleepy, until he saw the gifts on the tree. Then Mrs. Beaver offered the bluebird her flat tail as a sled. Around the tree she pulled him. All the animals were delighted to see how happy the bluebird was. In fact, they were all having so much fun, they didn't notice Mischief the Fox, but he saw them. What would he do? None of the animals moved. But Mischief looked so thin and hungry that Grumbles decided to offer him a sweet potato that Ringtail had brought. No one had ever offered Mischief anything before. He was so surprised that he actually smiled. And the animals of Cozy Valley smiled back. After Mischief gobbled up the sweet potato that Christmas morning, somehow he didn't feel like being mischievous anymore. While they were all busy making friends and looking at the gifts on the tree, the bluebird had hopped off Mrs. Beaver's tail, and then they saw him hopping up to the very top of the tree. He had only one way to show his thankfulness. The animals were overjoyed. The bluebird was singing. The bluebird was singing. Now they knew he was getting well, and the bluebird sang as no bluebird had ever sung before. His song was filled with the love he felt for all the animals, the same love which the animals had given him. And that was the story my grandfather used to tell me. His story of how the animals of Cozy Valley discovered the joy of making others happy at Christmas.